Hi, everyone. This is a Leadership with Heart podcast, and this is Heather Younger, your host. Employee experience is powered by emotions. Managers and or leaders within organizations get to choose which emotions they unleash from within the people they lead. Leaders, meaning supervisors or above in an organization, drive much of the positive or negative emotions by their actions or inactions, their words, or what they fail to say. When a manager chooses their words and their actions carefully, they exhibit great emotional intelligence. These managers are often thought of as leaders who care, or as I like to call them, leaders with heart. This special brand of leader drives engagement and loyalty simply by being themselves. Are these leaders perfect? Absolutely not. It is in their awareness and sharing of some of their imperfections that we realize their brilliance. In this podcast, I ask you to see yourself in the stories my guests tell about times when they were not the best versions of themselves, but how they used their hearts to guide them to a place of deeper connection with their teams and heightened leadership prowess. Enjoy. Hi, everybody. This is Heather with the Leadership of the Heart podcast, and really excited that I have Scott Shay on my show. I had him on, actually. Someone reached out to me, and I don't usually take unsolicited requests. They're either referred to me from someone I know or someone who listens in the show, or I hand pick them from just somewhere I've seen them, maybe on LinkedIn or out in social, and I hand pick them. But in this case, someone came to me and said, I think I listened to your show, and I think that Scott would be an amazing fit. And based on what I've already learned about him, I can tell. So welcome, Scott.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Heather.
So where are you anyway right now in your leadership journey?
Well, I am actually at a time when everything that I've learned is now coming to bear. We are in the midst of this huge COVID-19 crisis, and it's having a serious, devastating, if I could say, impact on the economy. And as a bank chairman and as co-founder of Signature Bank of New York, we're dealing every day. It's sort of a continuing 24-hour emergency with clients who are wondering whether to continue in business, regardless of this PPP program. Will business come back? How are they working with their employees, with their colleagues? And this is truly a time when the rubber meets the road, and a time when I think really you can see who are authentic leaders who care about people and who aren't. And it's an important time.
Oh, it's so true. Every call I've been on, my main focus has really been on that. It's like, listen, how you show up right now determines a lot about your business a year or several years down the road. It really does have a ripple effect. So how you show up as the leader right now for the people that are looking to you for guidance will make all the difference. So it means a lot to take time to be thinking about how you want to show up. And that means like in the communication and the actions you take on behalf of customers and employees, right? All of those things. And I think those organizations who don't put in that time or who go, hide their head in the sand are the ones who are going to pay a price later that they're not going to be happy about, right?
Well, there's no question. The last time we had this sort of crucible was, for at least in the banking world, the 2008 crisis. And I'll tell a quick story. When we first started Signature Bank, so we started Signature Bank from scratch. No deposits, no clients, no nothing, no systems, no nothing. And we opened our doors May 1st, 2001. And just after we opened, we called all of our 250 colleagues together and we said, we gave them the rah-rah, all of that, which is important and good. And we had a cocktail party. And I got up and I said, in 5 years, we're going to be a $5 billion bank. And in 10 years, we're going to be a $10 billion bank. And I made those numbers up, just totally right then and there. I don't know where they came from. So fast forward 5 years, we were actually a $3.8 billion bank. And I spent a lot of time thinking with my two partners, Joe DiPaolo and John Tamberlane, are we doing everything right? And we clearly thought we were doing the right things with traction and we were going in the right direction. We hadn't hit $5 billion, but you know what? I made up the number anyway. So does it really matter? So that took us just a year or so before the financial crisis. During the financial crisis, our values actually became clear. We hadn't done any subprime lending. We hadn't done any CDOs. We hadn't done any crazy construction lending, to beachfront properties that were, only going to work in a fantastic economy. We hadn't done any of that stuff because we took our depositors' money seriously. So we went in the next 5 years from $3.8 billion to a $14.8 billion bank. We actually gained $11 billion in just 5 years, much more than I ever thought we would do. I never thought we would get there. It's because people started to say, all these other banks are having troubles. They weren't thinking about their clients. They weren't thinking about whether deals that they were doing were good for both parties. And that like switched on a light for folks who were prospective clients. So we just grew. That was, in retrospect, that was the best time. It wasn't fun. Don't get me wrong. The financial crisis was not fun, but it was a time when we could show that we were there. And we are trying to do that again today.
Oh, well, that's good. And I think I see a lot of organizations really they're trying to show up. And I don't know how that translates in the back end. So, for example, there are a lot of organizations that are having to do furloughs or layoffs or any of that stuff, right? And some of this is a necessary evil, depending on, just where the state of the union is for that organization. But it's how they do it. Is it underhanded? Does it feel secret? And does it, is it not transparent? There are so many ways that you can do this the right way and leave people with dignity, leave people still having a positive perspective on your organization. And I think those are some of the things that they aren't considering. They may be considering one or two stakeholders, but they aren't looking holistically and they aren't looking long-term when it comes to the how behind executing in most cases. So that's kind of the concern I have, but that's because my lens is uniquely focused on that internal customer, the employee, and and hearing it, all the feedback. They come to me in many cases, right? And I'm hearing them, and it's their level of frustration and exhaustion over just that lack of authenticity and transparency through this process. So it's interesting. I think we're all going through it. I have friends. I actually just interviewed. Do you know who Eric Van Bramer is?
Yes, Eric Van Bramer at the SBA. Are you talking about the same person?
Eric Van Bramer. He's at Fed.
I'm sorry, he's at the Fed Chicago. I'm confused. Yes. He's at the Chicago Fed. Yes, I do know him.
So I just interviewed him yesterday because he's actually a good friend of mine, and I've been wanting to get him on for a long time. And finally, we're all home, and so it's well, I can actually get on now. So we were just talking about this kind of focus on. We didn't talk as much about what you were talking about, as much about the crisis, but everybody just being impacted every direction. So,
well, he's a very client-oriented person. And the one time that I came into contact with him, it's because there was an issue, and he's involved. I'm not giving away any secrets with the Fed wire transfer system, and he jumped in, full body into dealing with the issue at hand, and so he definitely showed that he showed up. He showed up early, and he stayed late until everything was resolved in a good and positive way. It's been reported a little bit in the newspapers. It was an issue with Finastra, and he showed up, and he deserves a lot of credit for that.
Oh, I love it.
But I would say this in terms of, we've tried very hard to be transparent. So we held a bank-wide virtual, Zoom must be making a ton of money here, a virtual town meeting. And we had everybody in the bank. I mean, not everybody showed up, but just about, and said, look, this is what we're doing. Here's how we're going forward. We took questions, and we created a way so that everybody could submit their questions anonymously. And so we didn't, you didn't have to worry about any asking the wrong thing. It went to one person who then filtered the questions under instructions not to divulge who was asking the questions. And we were, we said what we're, how we're going to make the bank work. And there's no question that the most valuable asset of the bank are our colleagues. No question about that, because everything else is just numbers and bits and bytes. And our my colleagues are now under tremendous pressure from their clients because clients are making these huge decisions that are existential for their companies. And so they need to be there sort of in a self-mindful way. They need to know where they stand, and they shouldn't be nervous. They should know where the bank stands, how the bank is going to treat their clients, in a direct and fair, I think, in a way that revolves around, well, I'll tell you my basic rule. I call it and I wrote about this in my book, In Good Faith. In my book, I talked about the golden rule. And as you know, the golden rule is as old as the Bible. And basically, Hillel said, Hebrew scriptures, the Christian scriptures, Hillel defined it this way: don't do what is hateful what will be hateful unto you to someone else. The rest is commentary, go learn it. And we actually have put that in our standards of conduct, because if you know that, even though the rest of the standards of conduct, you're a lawyer,
Yep.
Banks have to sign these huge standards of conduct. But basically what I said is, look, if you get this right, the rest is really detail. And if you don't do something to your client that you wouldn't want done to you, that'll take you a long way. It's really is the golden rule. And I think that we sometimes get so caught up in regulations and rules and the like that we lose sight of that very simple reality. Now, that doesn't mean we can always say yes to every loan. We can't. We're a bank.
No,
we have to make sure that deposits are safe and sound, and the bank is running a safe and sound way. On the other hand, that means we have to treat every client with compassion. And sometimes that's challenging, but we do it. And we want our colleagues to know that that's what they're going to be rewarded for. Not always for saying yes, but for always being compassionate and always letting the client know where they stand.
That's great. Well, I think that's a good philosophy. And I'm curious to know where, you founded this bank from scratch. Where does your drive to lead come from? What is it that makes you just naturally want to lead people? And actually, how long have you been doing that? Have you just been doing that your whole life in those roles?
Well, I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment. My parents had the bedroom. I lived in the dining room, and my mother's brother, my uncle, for many years lived in the living room on the couch, on the pull-out couch. And I'm the first one on either side of my family to go to college. I grew up the son of a Holocaust survivor. My father, actually, I don't know exactly when this is gonna run, but he was liberated from Dachau 75 years ago on May 1st, 1945. And so my journey to being here is actually quite unlikely. I didn't grow up thinking. My father was a carpenter. My mother worked for the local Teamsters Union. There was something that led me very deeply to, in all candor, not wanting to live in a one-bedroom apartment with 4 people in it. To be perfectly honest, I didn't think we were poor, and we never felt poor. But I did have this drive to do something a little more. And I'll be open about that. I think that I recognized, going to college is important. If I can go to college, if I can do more, then I can also contribute more. And my father encouraged me. My father actually wanted me to be an MD. He wanted me to be a doctor. He thought that was the best way to help people. But I'm really squeamish around the sight of blood, so it didn't go very far.
Well, I always ask that because I do notice now that I'm deep into writing this book based upon a lot of these interviews I've had, and there tend to be about 5 reasons why people, where their drive to lead comes from. And it ends up being, one of them is kind of having some type of adversity, some types of obstacles or barriers that maybe you perceived were in your way when you were younger. That's one of them. And so I think this idea of being a one-bedroom apartment with 4 people, I think I don't want to do that. That's a motivation. That's a drive.
Absolutely. There's nothing wrong with that. And
I don't think so at all.
But my father always centered me in a moral way. always did the right thing. I mean, I have to I'll tell you one other story about my father, which some things can be caught but not taught. And my father was really good at that. So in those days, every so often we grew up in Chicago, and he'd work sometimes, a lot of times on the south side of Chicago. And in those days, people weren't homeless, they were bums. I mean, that was the name they were called, right? I mean, they were drinking, they were this, they were that. They lived on, the south side. And occasionally he would bring someone home from the street. And he would give them, if we had an old coat, he'd give them an old coat. He'd feed them dinner. And I have to tell you, my younger self, my 7, 8, 9-year-old self, I was sort of a little bit afraid of these people who he would bring in, honestly. They didn't, necessarily look the best or smell the best, but he always treated people like they were, human beings. I mean, I think that came from his concentration camp experience, is to say, look, when somebody's really, really down and there seems to be nothing, how can you give them hope? And so my parents did not have a lot of funds, but they really didn't. But they always gave money to UJA in Chicago. They always felt like there were people with less, and how do I help them? And so, yes, I wanted to do better, but I always certainly recognized, my parents never raised me thinking, oh, we're poor. I mean, I didn't know what that meant until really I compared what we were doing with sort of the rest of the world. I don't think that never came out of their mouths.
Wow, that's powerful. I love those stories. Number one, stories are the things that I think grab our attention faster. We learn more from storytelling. So I'm a big advocate on stories. And so I do have a request. This is kind of the pivotal part of the podcast that I ask each guest. And it is, if you could remember and recall, for those who are listening, a time when maybe you were not the best leader, that you were not the best version of you. What did that look like specifically? And then what did you do to come out of that? What did you do to become more enlightened as a result?
So my first job out of business school I went to Northwestern, then I went to business school at Kellogg. Then I was blessed to get a job at Salomon Brothers, and I was working in investment banking. And I ultimately got promoted. I worked hard, and I got promoted, worked crazy hours, got promoted to vice president. And that was really the first time people were working for me. And I'll tell you what I did at first, which was a mistake. And I recognized it. I did recognize it quickly, but never quickly enough, is I started to treat people the way my bosses had treated me, which isn't so good on Wall Street. I mean, that means I'm not a yeller, but I realized to a certain degree I was emulating my bosses, and I was emulating them in terms of workflow, where, because I hadn't paid attention, I'd make it an emergency for someone else. And this was early in my career. And by the way, the new associates like me have to do sort of whatever you tell them to do. It is a bit of a real grind. I mean, people are making good money, don't get me wrong, but it's a grind too. I mean, you're working, my first day at Salomon Brothers, I worked until 11 o'clock at night. My second day, I worked until 3 a.m. the next morning, and I was in at 8. So, and that was expected. But it doesn't always have to be. And I will sadly but freely admit that in the beginning, I was not the boss I would want to be. And I changed. I mean, I really made an effort, a serious effort to change. Sort of once I just realized it, is I don't like this person that I become, because I become my old boss. And that
what was the
good.
catalyst for you how did you, when you realized it, what was the catalyst to realizing it? Was there some exchange that happened that made you realize it? What I'm curious.
I think it just was that the golden rule caught up with me. Would I really want to be treated this way that I'm treating somebody else? I mean, the golden rule is just like, if you keep that all the time, it's great. And I lost sight of it. And at a certain point, I thought, would I really want to be treated that way? Well, that was sort of the way I was treated, but is that any excuse? And it was from the most, smallest encounter with someone who was working for me, because I was making them do something that you know, I could have planned better. It wouldn't have necessarily needed to be an all-nighter. And I wasn't a terrible boss. I don't want to get you wrong. I wasn't vindictive or anything, but I was just acting like everybody else. And it was that recognition, it's not always the big things, because it's sometimes in our most intimate encounters that we can recognize things that really have epic consequences for our lives. So it could be a small thing, but the switch is turned.
Do you feel like you've ever seen any little signs of that over the years? Because now that's been some years ago.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you feel like there's been like times where it pops back up, where you go, like you can see it sneaking back in again?
Well, I try not, but we're all flawed humans.
Yes,
I want to tell you I'm not.
So true.
We try, but I certainly try not to let that get the best of me. What does it say in the beginning of the Bible? Sin always crouches at the door. That's what God tells Cain.
Yep. That is interesting. And I think that if we walked around with I have a different angle that someone enlightened me on actually just a few years ago, as I was talking about the golden rule, and the person said to me, which was just for me kind of earth shattering, because it's the work I do and it's actually how I live, but I wasn't thinking this way. And it is, instead of treating others as you'd like to be treated, treat them like they want to be treated. And the reason why this became like a big aha for me is before I was in employee experience and leadership, I was in the customer experience side of things. And we were doing journey mapping. I was always talking about customizing experience, personalizing experience. And then with the employees, like with my team members, I would always try to meet them where they were. But then I would say the golden rule, which was treat others as you'd like to be treated. And then I thought, wait a second, maybe you're probably onto something here, because it really is about others, because not everybody wants to be treated like I want to. Some people are completely fine with somebody yelling. Like, yelling doesn't even hurt. Some people are like, yep, I'm used to that in my family. Doesn't bug me at all. And the other person could completely cower under doing something like that, right? And so it's figuring out what makes each person tick, which is not scalable sometimes. However, I think it can be. I mean, I do think it can be, but when we think about kind of scaling companies, even on the customer experience side, oh my gosh, we've got like 100,000 customers. How the heck do I scale knowing what it is they want and how they want to be treated, right? And so it's, when you think of it that way, it's like, wow, that's a lot to take in. But I think the experience on both ends is much more rich. And that's what I've come to learn over these last few years, after this person kind of challenged me to think differently about the golden rule. Because we don't all have the same values, filter, background,
right.
Desires, needs, motivations, right? And so when you start to think about that, wow, wait, what are theirs? Theirs could be different than mine, and maybe they'll appreciate this way versus the way I thought they appreciated it. And I think for me, what I found is that if I take the time to get to know those who I do come in contact with, so let's say each of us has 6 direct reports, or each of us has 20 large clients, let's just say that, right? And I take that time to spend the time to build a relationship with them and get to know what are the things that, make them stay up at night? What are the things that just make them get frantic or whatever? Then I'm able to work around their needs more. And that's something that I've really kind of dove into over these last few years, even more than I did the many several before that.
That's good. Look, I think the golden rule, there are lots of different formulations for it. The reason I like Hillel's formulation is it's the most modest formulation. Just don't do unto someone else would be hateful unto you. Because I'm not 100% sure I'll get where you are. I hope I do. And then you can move on and you can be more demonstrative. You can do more. But in just, at the most modest level, at least for me, it works well. But the other thing is that it's definitely not scalable, which is why, but I think it is catchable. And so if that's the way you work with your 6 direct reports, then they might catch that and work that way with it's their 6 reports. It's not the kind of thing you can order.
Yeah, no, you can't. And I love the catchable thing. So I definitely love the how you're framing that, because I think it's true. It kind of goes back to leading by example. And if people watch you, and there's an assumption that people will always emulate, and that's not always the case. We know that there are people on this earth that just refuse to emulate those good things. And in that case, like in your case, right, you can just choose whether they stay on that team or not, because you want people to be there to emulate. And some people may confuse this or complain that this creates a non-diverse workplace because everybody's thinking one particular way. But I do think, like you're saying, this very basic, very kind of humble, foundational thing of the golden rule, it doesn't matter. Diversity can still exist inside of that.
Sure.
We need to treat each other a certain way,
For
period.
Sure.
So, but there are people who are like, well, if you have all these values and everybody's walking around doing the same thing, well, then, how diverse does that work for us? I hear that. I'm like, I hear you. I don't know if I agree with that, because I've seen the way it can work inside of any culture with any set of values. And I think the golden rule, some iteration of that is basic, but it's not always exercised. And I value it too. So I appreciate that in you. Now, so I'm curious, for those leaders who might be listening now, they might be at a crossroads in their leadership. They could be kind of at a struggle point or a turning point. What might be a couple of pearls of wisdom you'd lead them with today?
Well, again, I'd start with the golden rule for sure. As I've said, think about what your clients want from you, your colleagues want from you, how they'd want to be treated in sort of times of crisis. But the other thing I really look to is, your team, and what are they telling you, and making sure that they feel like they can tell you what you don't necessarily want to hear. Because this is a time, as we're in this current crisis, that there's lots going on, and it's not always pleasant to hear, and that may be within your organization. And not listening to people is not listening to the people who are directly where the rubber meets the road. That's dangerous in this sort of time, because you've got to listen to the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's plenty of ugly going on. And I would say, again, try to be authentic, because it doesn't help right now to start everything by saying, oh, our thoughts and prayers and this and that are with the victims of the COVID-19, and then to go on and, fire 12 people and to slash and burn. You've got to be authentic. And that's not easy. I don't want to say it's easy. There's no question this is a trying time. And what got people here won't necessarily get them to the next step. I would also really keep that in mind, is that to a certain degree, you have to throw out the rule book, because we just entered a new world. And I don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but if you start out with values, you start out by figuring what value are you delivering for your clients. That'll take you in a positive direction. And then, of course, you have to figure it out from there.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I believe in iteration. So I'm constantly like rebranding myself, rebranding my efforts, things that I do. And so I naturally am that kind of person. So every 2-3 years, I'm like, it's time to kind of change some things. But the one thing that warms my heart or makes me feel secure is that I have kind of timeless values in place. So kind of this idea of the golden rules is foundationally a part of that. But because it's so human-centered, and I think that no matter which direction we go, that human focus, that caring focus is going to be needed now more than ever, and it will be needed every time I point in one location or not, right? So we need that type of leadership. We need people who care for people. We need that connection between people. Right now, we really need it, as you can see, with us being so distant from everybody. When we come out of this, I do think it's going to be a different role. I think people are going to expect to have deeper connection. And so I'm excited to just be where I'm at in my shoes, but also be able to take so much of what you've said and what other people say on the show. I'm learning leaps and bounds. And I think that's the other thing we need to look forward to in the future, is we need to be keeping our minds open to learning a new way and then to execute on that way. But in the end, like the focus you have on, am I meeting, like, is it all stakeholders? Are they all receiving the value I'm telling them I'm going to give them? And do they feel it? Because that's what's going to make them want to stay with us, customers or employees or stockholders or whatever. If I'm not going to be giving them that value, they're going to leave.
Yes,
Period.
yes, for sure.
So I mean, that's what it boils down to. So I
sure.
love that. I love the fact that you focus on the value you're delivering. It's great. This has been awesome. What a great surprise.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. And for those who are listening, if you received a lot of value, no pun intended, but value in listening to the podcast, and you want to be able to share it, please do that. I mean, that's how we get more people listening and learning and hopefully changing as a result of what they're hearing. And then also don't forget to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you might listen. That helps on the algorithm. So there's other leadership podcasts, but I think there's something special here. The way we highlight things in leaders who are more emotionally intelligent, but that they're not perfect. And that's a big learning here. So thank you so much. And again, thanks so much, Scott. This has been great.
Thank you. All good things to you.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership with Heart podcast. You can grab the show notes by visiting customerfanatics.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter.